Silas Crow didn't knock. He never did. The door of the Whitmore ranch house swung open so hard it cracked against the inner wall, and 8 children flinched in unison. 8 children who had already buried their father 4 days ago, whose eyes were still swollen and whose hands still shook when they reached for anything. Silas stepped through the frame like he owned the floor beneath their feet, because in his mind, he already did. He was a large man, the kind whose size was less about muscle and more about the sheer weight of his own contempt for everyone around him. He wore a good coat in the middle of summer heat and held a folded document against his palm the way a man holds a weapon he hasn't drawn yet. He looked at the children. He didn't look at them the way you look at children who have lost something. He looked at them the way you assess livestock before a sale. "Where's the woman?" he said. If you have ever watched someone treat grieving children like furniture, you already know the particular kind of rage that settles in your chest like a stone. And if you have ever been a woman standing alone in a doorway with nothing but her own nerve between her and a man like that, then this story already belongs to you. Stay with us. Because what Clara Whitmore did next, what she refused to do, what she chose instead, is the kind of thing they don't put in history books but should. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because we have more stories coming that will shake you to your core. Hit that like button, leave a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train from St. Louis took 4 days. Clara Whitmore spent most of those 4 days sitting upright in the second-class car, with her hands folded in her lap and her traveling trunk wedged between her ankles, because she didn't trust the overhead rack, and she didn't trust the men who kept glancing at a woman traveling alone. She had $43 tucked into the lining of her left boot, $17 in her small coin purse, and a letter she had read so many times the fold lines had worn soft as cloth. The letter was from a man named Robert Hale. She had answered his advertisement in the Missouri Republican the previous October, after the school where she'd taught for 6 years closed for lack of funds, and her landlady had raised the rent by an amount Clara could not meet on substitute work alone. The advertisement had been plain and honest in a way she'd appreciated. Most of those notices read like a man describing a job he needed filled, and in a way, she supposed that's what they were. But Robert Hale had written, "I am not looking for a servant or a decoration. I have 7 children who need steadiness, and I have a ranch that needs more than one pair of hands. I am a widower, not a young man, and I will not pretend otherwise. If you are a woman of plain sense who understands that life in Kansas is hard work and no guarantee, I would be grateful to hear from you." She had written back the same evening. They had exchanged 11 letters over 4 months. She knew he was 41, that his wife Margaret had died of fever 2 winters past, that his eldest son Elias was 12 and already too old in the eyes for his age, that the youngest was an infant named Ruth, who had never known her mother. She knew he ran cattle on 320 acres of Barton County land, and that the land was mortgaged but manageable. And she knew from the careful way he wrote around certain subjects that money was tighter than he let on. She was not a fool. She had read the spaces between his words. But she had also read his kindness, and that was harder to fake across 11 letters than most men realized. She stepped off the train at Walnut Creek Station on a Tuesday morning in July, and the heat hit her like a wall she hadn't seen coming. The platform was half a dozen planks over packed dirt, and there was a general store, a livery, and a man sleeping in a rocking chair outside what might have been a barber's shop. She stood with her trunk and her bag, and she waited. No one came for 20 minutes. She told herself not to read into it. Ranches were not close. A man with 7 children had 100 reasons to run late, and none of them meant anything except that the world did not stop turning because a train arrived on schedule. Then she saw the boy. He came on a brown mare that was too big for him, riding bareback with his knees gripping her sides, and his face set in an expression that Clara would not understand until he got closer. He was thin. He was wearing a shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever color it started as into something between gray and nothing. His feet were bare in the stirrups. He pulled the horse up 10 feet from her and stared. Clara waited. "Are you the woman?" he said. "The one coming to marry my father?" "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "Is your father nearby?" The boy's jaw tightened. He looked at some point past her shoulder and then looked back. And she saw it then. The thing she had mistaken for blankness was not blankness at all. It was a 12-year-old boy holding himself together by sheer force of will. My father died, he said, 5 days ago. It was his heart. Clara heard the words, she understood them. But there is a difference between understanding a thing with your mind and the moment when it lands in your body, and that landing took a few seconds longer than thought. She stood on the platform in the July heat, and the boy watched her with those old eyes, and neither of them spoke. I'm sorry, she said finally. Elias. He blinked. She had used his name. She wasn't sure why that mattered to him, but something in his face shifted almost invisibly. Yes, ma'am, he said. I came to bring you back if you want to come. Or I came to tell you if you'd rather take the next train. He swallowed. I figured you had a right to know before you decided. She looked at him. 12 years old, alone on a big horse, delivering a message no grown man would have wanted to deliver, and still thinking about her right to make a choice. Robert Hale had raised something right, even if he hadn't lived to finish the raising. How far is the ranch? She said. Hour and a half. Then let's go, Clara said. Help me with the trunk. She didn't know what she was deciding yet. She told herself she was simply going to see, that she owed it to the children to at least look at the situation before making any choice. That was the version she gave herself on the ride out, watching the flat Kansas land spread around them in every direction, yellow grass and sky, and the occasional dark line of a windbreak trying to hold against the open. The mare carried her without protest. Elias rode beside her on a smaller horse he'd traded the mare for at the livery. He'd brought 2 horses, she realized, which meant he had expected her to come. He didn't talk much. She didn't push it. When the ranch house came into view, she adjusted her expectations downward without letting her face show it. The house was a 1-story wood-frame structure that had been built with optimism and maintained with whatever was left over after more urgent expenses, which was apparently not much. One corner of the roof sagged. The front porch had lost 2 of its boards to rot or weather or both. The fence around what should have been a kitchen garden was listing badly to one side, but smoke came from the chimney, and that meant someone inside was trying. Elias dismounted and tied the horses without looking at her, and she climbed down herself and followed him to the door, and he opened it, and she walked in. There were 7 of them, not crowded into the front room in any organized way, scattered through it in the particular disorder of children who had been trying to manage without direction for almost a week. A girl of about 10 was attempting to nurse a fire in the cook stove with green wood that kept smoking without catching. 2 boys who looked to be 8 and 6 were sitting against the far wall with their knees pulled up. A girl of maybe 4 was asleep on the floor with a quilt pulled over her despite the heat, which told Clara someone had known enough to keep her comfortable. And near the window, a boy of perhaps 9 was holding a cloth bundle very carefully, the kind of careful that meant the cloth bundle was not a bundle at all. The baby. Ruth. Clara crossed the room without thinking. The boy holding the baby, she would learn his name was Thomas, looked up at her with an expression halfway between suspicion and relief. She took some milk this morning, he said, but she won't stop making that sound. Clara listened. The sound coming from the bundle was thin and high and exhausted, the sound of an infant who had been crying for a long time and had run out of energy for full crying but could not stop entirely. It was a sound that Clara recognized from her years teaching. She'd heard it from babies brought to the schoolroom by older siblings in emergencies, and it was a sound that meant something is wrong and no one has fixed it yet. "May I?" she said to Thomas. He hesitated. This stranger, this woman who was supposed to be his father's wife, and wasn't, who had no claim on any of them. And then he held the baby out. Clara took Ruth into her arms, and the baby's head was too hot. Not the warmth of a sleeping child. The wrong kind of warmth. "Has she been like this since yesterday?" Clara asked. Thomas nodded. "Since the day before," said a voice from the doorway behind her. She turned. Standing in the kitchen doorway was a girl of about 14, older than Elias, she'd learn later, though not by much, with her arms folded and her eyes dry in the way of someone who had decided that crying was a thing she no longer had the resources for. This was Hannah, the eldest girl, who had been running this household for the past 5 days on 14-year-old determination and a very limited knowledge of infant care. "We didn't know what to do," Hannah said. Her voice was flat. Not cold. Flat. The flatness of someone who has been scared for so long that the fear had compressed into something harder. "We tried the milk. We tried keeping her warm. We didn't know who to—" She stopped. "We didn't know." Clara looked at the baby and then at Hannah. "Do you have any willow bark?" she said. Hannah blinked. "I don't know." "Look in whatever your father kept for medicines. Anything in a dried bundle, anything in a tin marked for fever or pain. Go look right now." Hannah went. Clara turned to Thomas. "Boil me water. Clean water, as hot as you can get it." She looked at the girl by the stove. "Come help your brother with the fire." The girl scrambled up. Clara sat down in the nearest chair with Ruth against her chest and began doing the only thing immediately within her power, which was keeping the baby's body positioned so her breathing stayed clear, and talking quietly to her so she'd know there was a voice in the room that knew her name and wasn't afraid. She was afraid. She just didn't let Ruth hear it. Hannah came back with a small tin that turned out to contain dried willow bark and 2 other herbs Clara didn't recognize but that smelled medicinal enough to be trusted. She made a weak tea, cooled it to barely warm, and spent the next hour coaxing small amounts of liquid into Ruth with a clean cloth, drop by careful drop, with 2 children watching her from the doorway and one sitting right beside her because he couldn't make himself leave. The baby's temperature was still high when Clara's hands started shaking from hunger. She hadn't eaten since a biscuit the morning before, but it was not climbing anymore, and that was something. Elias appeared at her elbow with a bowl of something that turned out to be a very thin porridge, lumpy and underseasoned, the best that could be done with what they had. "Hannah made it," he said. "We didn't know if you—" He stopped, started over. "You can eat it. It's all right." Clara ate the porridge. It tasted like nothing in particular, but she ate every bit of it. That night, when all 7 children were finally asleep, Ruth in a wooden box padded with folded cloth that someone had rigged as a makeshift cradle, the others arranged through the 2 small bedrooms in whatever configuration had become habit. Clara sat at the kitchen table with a candle and tried to think. She made a list in her head the way she always did when she needed to understand a situation. The list was not encouraging. The baby was sick and needed consistent care for at minimum the next few days. The children had been surviving on whatever was in the root cellar and pantry, and from what she could see, that supply would last perhaps another week, maybe 10 days if stretched. The roof sagged, not just because it was old, but because 2 rafters had been improperly repaired at some point and were working loose. She could see the place where the ceiling bowed. The stove needed a new flue gasket because the smoke was backing up slightly on windy draws, which was a fire risk. And somewhere in all of this, there was presumably a mortgage on 320 acres that Robert Hale had described as manageable, which might or might not be true, depending on what else she didn't know yet. The next train east left Walnut Creek Station on Friday. Today was Tuesday. She sat with the candle burning low, and she thought about Philadelphia, where she had a cousin who had offered vaguely to find her work if things got difficult. She thought about the school in Missouri that had closed and whether enough students had returned that it might reopen in fall. She thought about $43 in her boot and $17 in her purse, and the fact that the return fare would take most of what she had. Then she stopped thinking about Philadelphia, because there was a sound from the back bedroom. Not crying exactly, something smaller than crying, the sound of a child trying not to be heard. And she picked up her candle and went down the short hallway and opened the door. The 4-year-old. Lily, she'd been told. Sitting up in the bed she shared with the older girl, both hands pressed over her mouth. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm here," she said. Lily stared at her with enormous eyes. "Are you going to leave?" the child whispered. The directness of it, 4 years old and already asking the question that mattered most. The question all 7 of them were probably asking in whatever version their age permitted. Clara looked at her. She had not made a decision yet. She was absolutely certain of that. She had made no promises, and she was under no obligation, and the situation was more dire than anything she had prepared herself for, and a rational woman would wait for morning at minimum before committing to anything. "No," Clara said. The word came out before she finished thinking it through. Lily dropped her hands, and her face did something complicated. Relief and suspicion mixed together in the proportion of someone who wanted very much to believe and had learned that wanting wasn't enough. "My papa said someone was coming," Lily said. "He said she'd take care of us." "Go to sleep," Clara said. "I'll be here in the morning." She sat on the edge of the bed until Lily's breathing went slow and deep. Then she walked back to the kitchen table and she sat down again, and she didn't think about Friday's train. She thought instead about willow bark tea and roof rafters, and whether there was a cow somewhere on this property that could provide reliable milk for the baby. She hadn't decided anything. That's what she told herself. Wednesday began before sunrise because the baby needed to be fed, and the fire needed starting, and there was no one else who knew what to do with the combination of those two facts. And somewhere in the doing of the first necessary thing and then the next necessary thing, Clara stopped waiting to decide and simply became the person who was deciding by action. She found the cow. There was one, a brindle thing named Bessie, by some previous family member who was temperamental and hadn't been milked properly in 5 days and was deeply unhappy about it. Clara had grown up with cows. She sat down on the three-legged stool and she spoke to Bessie in the same low tone she'd used with Ruth. And after some initial protest, the cow permitted it, and Clara came back inside with a pail of milk and the particular satisfaction of a practical problem solved. Ruth took the milk better than she had the day before. Her forehead was cooler. Elias came in when the sun was just clearing the horizon and found Clara at the stove and stopped. "I thought maybe," he said, and then didn't finish the sentence. "I thought maybe too," Clara said. "Set the table." He set the table. The younger children appeared one by one as the smell of cooking reached them, cautious at first, orbiting the kitchen doorway before coming inside, watching her from the corners of their eyes. She learned names while she worked: Elias, 12, Hannah, 14, who was already old enough to be suspicious of Hope, Thomas, 9, who had been holding the baby, James and Samuel, 8 and 6, the pair against the wall, Lily, 4, who had asked the direct question in the dark, and Ruth, who had no age yet, who was the beginning and end of her own urgent problem. She made biscuits with flour that was almost out and eggs from 3 hens. Elias showed her behind this barn, and she made them good because good food was not a luxury in a house full of frightened children. It was one of the few immediate forms of proof she could offer that things might be manageable. James ate his biscuit in about 4 bites and then looked at her. "Are you our mother now?" he said. Hannah, across the table, looked up sharply. Thomas stared at the table. Elias's jaw tightened. "I'm Clara," she said. "Let's start there." She found the ledger on Thursday. Robert Hale had been a careful man in some ways, careful enough to keep records, which was more than could be said of a lot of men. The ledger was in the bottom drawer of the desk in the corner of the main room, under a surveyor's map and a certificate of homestead filing. She sat down with it after the children were settled, and she opened it and she read. The mortgage on the land was held by the Crow Cattle Company at an interest rate that had been reasonable enough when it was signed, but had compounded in ways that seemed to her, not a banker, not a lawyer, but a woman who had kept her own household accounts since she was 16, somewhat aggressive. The original principal was $1,200. The current balance, per Robert Hale's most recent calculation dated 3 months before his death, was $1,041, which was not a manageable number. Not for a ranch that, from what she could see, was barely producing enough to feed 8 people. The name at the top of the mortgage document was Silas Crow, Crow Cattle Company, Barton County, Kansas. She set the ledger down and sat with that information for a while. She didn't know the name yet. She didn't know anything about Silas Crow except his name on a document, which told her only that he was owed money by a dead man whose children now sat in this house with no legal protection and no plan. She would learn more soon enough. Friday came. The train to St. Louis left Walnut Creek Station at noon. Clara was in the kitchen at noon, teaching Hannah how to stretch a pot of beans with salt pork and wild onions, explaining it as she did it rather than just doing it, because teaching was the thing that actually helped, whereas just doing it only helped once. She did not think about the train. She thought about the flue gasket, which she had asked Elias to look for in the tool shed, and about whether there was any way to know if the cattle that should be on these 320 acres were actually still on them or had drifted, and about whether she could get to town and back before dark if she left immediately after dinner. She had $43 in her boot. It was going to have to be enough to start. Whoa. The man came on Saturday. He didn't knock. The door swung open the way Clara would later learn Silas Crow always entered rooms he considered his own, which was every room he could think of a reason to enter, and he stepped through the frame and looked at the children with the eyes of a man valuing property, and he said, "Where's the woman?" Clara came out of the kitchen. She was carrying a dish towel, which she was still wiping her hands on, because she had been washing up when she heard the door, and she had not put the towel down. She would later be glad of that. The dish towel made her look like what she was, which was a woman in the middle of ordinary work. And there was something in ordinary work that men like Silas Crow did not know how to calculate into their threats. He looked her over once, assessed, decided. "You're the mail-order bride," he said. "The one that was supposed to marry Robert Hale." "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "And you are?" "Silas Crow." He said it the way men say a name they expect to land with weight. "I hold the mortgage on this property." "I'm aware of that." Something moved across his face, just briefly, the slight recalibration of a man who expected this to be simpler. "Hale's gone. The debt's still here. I'll need the loan paid in full, or secured with property, within 60 days. The children were watching, all of them, from various positions around the room. Even the baby seemed to have gone still. Clara folded the dish towel over her arm. "I'll need to see the paperwork," she said. Crow smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never been asked for paperwork by anyone who wasn't a lawyer, and who found the request mildly amusing in the way that power finds small resistance amusing before it removes it. "Of course," he said. He held up the folded document. "Right here." She crossed the room and took it from him. Took it. He didn't offer it. She simply reached out and took it. And she unfolded it and read it while he stood there. She had read enough documents to know when something wasn't right. The numbers were right. The signature was right. The date was right. But the clause at the bottom, the one specifying the remedies in case of default, was not the kind of clause that appeared in ordinary mortgage agreements. It specified not just the land as collateral, but all improvements in livestock and personal property on the land, and it specified that in the event of default, the lender had the right to take possession immediately, without court order, and to dispose of said property at his own discretion. She had never seen that kind of clause before. "Where did you say you were from, Mr. Crow?" she said. "I didn't," he said. 60 days, Miss Whitmore. Or I take what I'm owed." He looked at the children again. "All of it." He left. The door closed, not slammed, which was almost worse than slamming would have been, because it meant he saw no reason to dramatize. He simply left, the way you leave a place that's already yours. Elias came to stand beside her. She was still holding the document. "What does it mean?" he said quietly. Clara looked at the clause again. Then she folded the document very precisely along its original lines and held it against her side. "It means," she said, "that we have 60 days to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She did not tell him what she suspected, that the clause was too specific, that the numbers had compounded at a rate that should have required renegotiation but hadn't, which meant Robert Hale either hadn't known or hadn't had anyone to help him understand. That Silas Crow had not come to collect a debt. He had come to see how easily what he was planning would go. She didn't tell Elias any of that. What she said instead was, "Go check on Ruth, and tell Hannah we need to eat dinner early tonight. I have some reading to do." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he went. Clara sat down at the desk with the mortgage document and the ledger and the surveyor's map and the deed, and she began to read everything she had, in the order it would tell her the most, the way she used to prepare lessons. Not for what she hoped to find, but for what was actually there. Outside, the July heat sat heavy on the Kansas land. 320 acres that she had no legal claim to. 8 children who had called no one mother in 2 years. A debt that smelled wrong in a way she couldn't yet name. And 60 days. She pulled the candle closer and kept reading. The morning after Silas Crow's visit, Clara woke before anyone else and sat at the desk in the gray pre-dawn dark and read through every document a second time. She had slept maybe 3 hours. Her eyes felt gritty and her neck ached from the angle she'd held her head the night before, hunched over the ledger by candlelight until the candle burned itself to a nub. But she had learned something which was worth the neck ache. The mortgage had been signed 4 years ago, when Margaret Hale was still alive and the ranch was running at a different capacity. The interest rate, 9% compounding annually, was not unusual on its face, not for frontier land financing, not with a lender who held the risk on undeveloped acreage. What was unusual was the acceleration clause buried in the 3rd page in language, so dense it read like it was trying not to be understood. In the event of the borrower's death or incapacitation, the full remaining balance became due within 60 days at the lender's discretion, not upon default, not upon missed payment, upon death. Robert Hale had been one missed heartbeat away from losing everything he'd built, and he may not have known it, or he had known and believed he had more time. Clara set the document down and looked out the window at the dark that was slowly going lighter at the horizon. 320 acres of Kansas grassland, a sagging house, 8 children who had nothing, and a man who had designed this situation with some patience and considerable legal cunning. She needed a lawyer. She had $60 in change. She needed to understand the water situation. That would require talking to neighbors, and she didn't know any neighbors yet. She needed the ranch to function, producing enough to demonstrate activity and income, because a working operation complicated any seizure claim in ways that a merely occupied property did not. She needed all of these things simultaneously, and she had no allies and no time. She heard the baby stir. She got up and went to Ruth first, because that was the only sensible order of operations. The fever broke on Sunday morning, broke fully, not just retreated, and Clara sat back on her heels in the small room and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 days. Ruth looked up at her with the unfocused gaze of a 4-month-old who knew warmth from cold and familiar, from strange, and not much else yet, and she made a sound that was not crying, and that was the best thing Clara had heard since she stepped off the train. Thomas was in the doorway. He was 9 years old, and he had been checking on his baby sister every 2 hours, including through the night, appearing silently in doorways, looking, retreating. Clara had started leaving the door slightly open so he could see without having to ask. "She's better," Clara said, not turning around. She heard Thomas's exhale, heard him slide down the door frame until he was sitting on the floor. She glanced back and his head was tipped against the wood, and his eyes were closed, and he was allowing himself, just for a moment, to be 9 years old and relieved. "You should sleep," she said. "I slept," he said. The way he said it, quick, flat, was the voice of a child who had decided that admitting need was a kind of weakness he could no longer afford. She recognized it. She'd heard it from students who came to school hungry and claimed they'd eaten. "Thomas." He opened his eyes. "You can be tired," she said. "That's allowed." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled his knees to his chest and went quiet again, not sleeping but resting, and that was enough. She got to town on Monday. Elias drove her in the wagon. The horse that pulled it was elderly and opinionated about pace, so the hour-and-a-half ride took closer to 2, but they arrived before noon at Walnut Creek's Main Street, which was one proper street with a bank, a dry goods store, a feed store, a post office, and a building with a hand-painted sign that said, "Garfield T. Moss, Attorney at Law, Notary, Land Claims." She had left Hannah in charge of the house and the baby with very specific instructions, and Hannah had received them with the expression of someone who wanted to argue about the fact of needing instructions, but recognized this was not the moment. Elias tied the horse outside the attorney's office and looked at her. "You want me to come in?" "Stay with the wagon," she said. "I won't be long." Garfield T. Moss turned out to be a small man with a large desk and the particular manner of a lawyer in a small town. Helpful enough to collect fees, cautious enough not to make enemies of people who might outlast him. He read the mortgage document she put in front of him without touching it, leaning forward over his desk. He straightened up after a while and looked at her. "The acceleration clause is legal," he said. "Unusual, but legal. Mr. Hale signed it." "I understand it's legal," Clara said. "I want to know if it's the whole picture." Moss was quiet for a moment. "There are other considerations," he said carefully, "that might affect Crow's ability to act as quickly as he's implied. The estate would need to go through probate. The children are minors. A county court would need to appoint a guardian before any property disposition affecting their inheritance could. So he can't just take it," Clara said. "Not without a court order, which he would likely obtain eventually, given the debt is real and the clause is enforceable, but—" Moss paused. "It would take longer than 60 days. "How much longer?" "That depends on whether anyone contests it, whether someone presents the court with a reason to look more carefully at the situation." He looked at her steadily. "Are you planning to contest it?" "I'm planning to understand it first," Clara said. "What do you know about Silas Crow?" The pause that followed was informative on its own. "He's a significant landowner in the county," Moss said finally. "He runs cattle. He also holds mortgages on several properties in the area. He's been—" Another pause. "He's been active in acquiring land over the past several years. How many of those mortgages have acceleration clauses?" Moss looked at her. She looked back. "I couldn't say," he said. But the way he said it meant he could and wouldn't. Clara thanked him and paid his consultation fee from the coin purse rather than the boot money, because the boot money was for something specific that she hadn't worked out yet, and she left. Elias was outside with the wagon, eating an apple he'd produced from somewhere. "Well," he said. "We have more time than Crow wants us to think we do," she said, "and he knows it, which means the 60-day deadline is pressure, not law." Elias chewed his apple and considered this. "So what do we do?" "We go to the feed store," Clara said, "because we're here and the horse needs grain, and then we go home and I figure out what he actually wants." What Silas Crow actually wanted became clearer 3 days later, when Clara walked the full eastern boundary of the property with Elias and found the creek. It wasn't a dramatic creek, 10-12 feet across at its widest, running clear and steady even in July. But it ran year-round, Elias told her. It ran through the property from north to south and then cut east toward the Crow Range, or rather toward the land that bordered the Crow Range, land that was dry in summer, very dry. "Did your father ever talk about the water?" Clara asked. Elias squinted at the creek. "Crow offered to buy the eastern 40 acres about a year ago. Papa said no." Clara looked at the creek. Then she looked at where it ran. Then she went back to the surveyor's map that evening, and she looked at the creek's course and where the land boundaries fell, and where the Crow holdings were marked in faded ink, and she understood. This was not about the debt. The debt was the method. The water was the reason. Silas Crow's holdings to the east were considerable, but summer dry. The Hale property sat on top of the only reliable water source in a 5-mile stretch. If Crow acquired this land and the water rights that came with it, he could expand his cattle operation threefold and hold every other farmer and rancher in the valley at his pleasure, because in Kansas in 1883, whoever controlled the water controlled everything downstream of it. Robert Hale had known this. He'd refused to sell the eastern 40 acres. So Crow had waited, held the mortgage with its buried acceleration clause, and waited for Robert Hale to die, which he had, on schedule or close enough. And now here were 8 orphaned children and 1 woman from Missouri standing between Silas Crow and everything he'd been building toward for years. Clara sat with the map for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee because she needed to think clearly, and sentiment was not going to carry any of this. And while the coffee was heating, she made another list in her head, this one of assets rather than problems, because she had spent enough time on problems. Assets, the water, the deed, which was clear and uncontested, the fact that probate took time and Crow couldn't legally move before a court ruled, the fact that she could read contracts and apparently most of the women in this situation couldn't, or at least Crow had calculated they wouldn't. Elias, who was 12 but not stupid and who knew this land better than anyone. Hannah, who was 14 and formidable when she stopped being frightened long enough to act. The 320 acres themselves, which were viable if actually worked. And the neighbors, who she hadn't talked to yet, but who presumably had their own reasons to be nervous about a man who was quietly accumulating land and water rights in Barton County. She poured the coffee and drank it standing at the stove. Then she went to bed and slept properly for the first time since the train. The cattle were still on the property, 31 head, which was fewer than the ledger suggested there should be, but still 31 head. And the problem was that 31 cattle without active management was 31 cattle in the process of slowly becoming 28, then 25, through the ordinary attrition of animals left without proper oversight. 2 of the cows were showing signs of bloat from the south pasture grass, which meant someone needed to move them, and the fence on the northwest corner had been down for what looked like weeks. Elias knew cattle. Not perfectly, he was 12, but enough. He'd been working alongside his father since he could keep up, and what he didn't know from experience he knew from watching, and what he didn't know from watching he'd ask about, with a pragmatism that Clara found both useful and a little heartbreaking, because the pragmatism was what happened when a boy was required to become useful too young. They moved the bloated cows on Wednesday morning, Elias in front and Clara behind, which was not an elegant operation. She'd handled dairy cows but not range cattle, and the difference was significant. She got her skirt muddy, and one cow shoved her sideways hard enough to put her into the fence, which left a bruise on her hip that lasted a week. But they moved them. James and Samuel, the 6- and 8-year-olds, had attached themselves to this project with the tenacity of small boys who have discovered that helping is a way of not feeling helpless. James handed her fencing pliers without being asked, correctly anticipating she'd need them. Samuel held the horse. They were both covered in mud by the time the corner fence was repaired, and Samuel had a scrape on his forearm from the wire that he presented to Clara afterward with a combination of pride and pain that was purely 8 years old. She cleaned the scrape and wrapped it and called him brave without calling him careless, which was the right balance. Hannah watched all of this from a careful distance. This was Hannah's pattern. Observe first, volunteer nothing, hold herself slightly apart as though approval were a thing she'd been burned by before. Clara didn't push. She could see Hannah helping. The house was cleaner than it should have been with a woman otherwise occupied all day. And the meals that Hannah managed when Clara was outside were not good but were competent and getting more competent by the day. But Hannah helped invisibly, as though she needed to be able to deny it. On Thursday evening, Clara came inside from splitting kindling to find Hannah sitting at the kitchen table with the household ledger open in front of her, a piece of paper beside it, and a pencil in her hand. "What are you doing?" Clara said. "We're almost out of salt," Hannah said without looking up. "And the cornmeal won't last past next week. And we have no candles." Clara stood in the doorway with the kindling in her arms. "I added up what we need," Hannah said. She pushed the paper across the table without making eye contact. "I tried to put it in order of what matters most first." Clara set down the kindling and picked up the paper. The handwriting was small and careful, and the arithmetic was right. "You can do figures," Clara said. "Papa taught me." A pause. "He said a woman who can't keep accounts ends up depending on men who can't be trusted." She said this in a tone that made it clear she was quoting something she had thought about a great deal. "Your father was right," Clara said. Hannah finally looked up. Something in her face wanted very much to ask a question, and something else in her face was not ready to ask it yet. "The salt is most important," Clara agreed. "We'll go to town Saturday. You'll come with me." Hannah looked back at the ledger. "I don't need to—" "I know you don't need to," Clara said. "Come anyway." She met Martin Briggs at the feed store on Saturday. He was a rancher, 50-ish, with the sun-cracked look of a man who had spent 30 years outdoors in Kansas and accepted the result without complaint. He was loading sacks into a wagon when Clara arrived, and he nodded at her the way people nod at strangers they recognize as new to the area. "You're the woman out at the Hale place," he said. Not unfriendly, just factual. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "You knew Robert?" "For 12 years. He hoisted a sack." "Good man. Sorry about what happened." She helped Hannah carry the salt to the counter and paid for it while the storekeeper tallied their other items, and she said, without making it seem like the primary conversation, "Mr. Briggs, did you know Robert had an acceleration clause in his mortgage with Crow?" Briggs set down the sack he was holding. "Did he?" he said. Not a question. "He did." She looked at him steadily. "I'm wondering if that's a common arrangement in the county or if Robert's situation was particular." Briggs was quiet for long enough that Clara started to wonder if she'd misjudged him. Then he said, "My mortgage was renegotiated 2 years ago. Crow bought out the original lender. I signed new terms." "Do you know what terms you signed?" Another pause. "I thought I did." She handed him the name she'd gotten from Garfield Moss, not Moss himself, who was clearly too entangled in local politics to be fully useful, but a land attorney in Dodge City who Moss had mentioned with the careful neutrality of someone pointing at something without wanting to be seen pointing. "This man handles estate and land claims," she said. "He might be worth writing to." Briggs took the paper. He looked at it, then at her. "You're not just trying to save the Hale place," he said. "I'm trying to understand what Crow is building," she said. "And I think the picture is probably bigger than one ranch." She collected Hannah and the salt and the cornmeal and 3 candles, which was all they could afford, and she drove home. Hannah was quiet for most of the ride, which was her default. But about 20 minutes out, she said, "That man knew something he didn't want to say." "Yes?" Clara said. "Will he help?" Clara considered the question honestly. "I don't know. He's scared. Scared men either help or they make things worse. She watched the road. We'll find out. The second week was harder than the first in ways she hadn't anticipated, which mostly had to do with the children themselves. The emergency of the first week, Ruth's fever, Crow's visit, the immediate practical crises, had organized everyone around obvious purpose. But in the second week, the emergency settled into a lower grade difficulty that was actually harder to manage because it was less defined. Lily started waking twice each night calling for her father, which meant Clara was up twice a night, which meant everyone heard the crying even when they didn't get up. And the sound of a small child calling for a dead man had a way of sitting in a house and not leaving when morning came. James got into a fight with Samuel over something small and pointless, the way brothers do when they're actually fighting about something else entirely, and it escalated until Samuel threw a tin cup and it hit the wall 6 inches from the window, and Clara had to intervene and then figure out what was actually wrong, which turned out to be that Samuel had found a piece of paper in his father's coat pocket, a note that said "Only good boy" in Robert's handwriting, which apparently was something Robert had written to himself to remember to say. And he didn't know what to do with having found it, and the not knowing had come out as a cup against the wall. She sat with Samuel on the porch steps for a while after that, and didn't try to make it better, because some things don't get better, they just get lived with. And she'd found over years of teaching that children knew the difference between someone helping them feel better and someone sitting with them in the actual feeling. Thomas, meanwhile, had assigned himself to Ruth so completely that Clara had to establish some negotiated boundaries about sleeping and meals, because he would have sat beside that wooden cradle forever if left unsupervised. She didn't argue with the protectiveness. It was its own kind of love, and it was real. She just made sure he ate and slept, and occasionally did something that had nothing to do with the baby. Elias was the one she worried about most and said the least about. He worked from dawn past dark without complaint and without being asked. He knew where everything was, what needed doing, what could wait. He was better on horseback than she was, and better with the cattle than she admitted, and she was genuinely relying on him for things that should not have been a 12-year-old boy's responsibility. She knew this. She tried to redirect tasks when she could, gave him things that were less urgent, insisted he eat dinner sitting down instead of standing in the doorway, because standing in the doorway meant he was ready to leave again, and she needed him to understand that resting was also allowed. But one evening she came out to the barn and found him sitting in the hay with the old ledger open across his knees, and he wasn't reading it. He was just holding it, in the way you hold a thing that belonged to someone you miss. She sat down in the hay beside him. He used to do the accounts on Sunday nights, Elias said, after supper, right there at the desk. He'd do them, and then he'd tell us what the week had cost, and what the week had earned, and whether we were ahead or behind. Was it usually ahead or behind? Elias almost smiled. Behind, but not by as much as it could have been, he always said. He closed the ledger. He was trying. I know, Clara said. Elias looked at the barn wall. If Crow takes the place, where do the little ones go? She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it more than she'd let herself show. He's not taking it, she said, but if he does. He's not, Clara said. Not to end the conversation, but because she'd made a decision she hadn't put into words yet, and this seemed like the moment. Elias, I don't know exactly how this gets fixed, but I know Crow's plan depends on us being easy to move, and I'm not planning to be easy to move, so he'll have to find another way, and there isn't one. Elias turned that over. You sound like you know that, he said. I'm working on knowing it, she said. That counts. He handed her the ledger. You should probably keep this. You understand it better than I do. She took it. They sat in the barn for another few minutes without talking, which was its own kind of conversation, and then they both went back inside. Crow came again at the end of the second week. This time he did knock, which was almost more unsettling because it meant he'd decided to change his approach. Clara opened the door. He was alone this time. No hired man waiting in the yard, no performative display of backing, just Crow in his good coat, holding his hat in his hands, which was a gesture she did not trust for 1 second. Miss Whitmore, he said, I wanted to talk, if you have a moment. I have a moment, she said, and did not invite him in. She stepped onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. Something crossed his face. He'd expected to be let inside. I've been thinking, he said, that the situation here might benefit from a more practical resolution. You're in a difficult position. These children are in a difficult position. I wonder if there's an arrangement that serves everyone better than a prolonged legal dispute." "What kind of arrangement?" she said. "The eastern 40 acres, the creek access. If you were willing to convey those to me now, at fair price, I'd be willing to restructure the remaining mortgage at favorable terms, extend the timeline, reduce the rate." He looked at her with the patient expression of a man who believed he was being generous. "It would relieve a considerable burden." Clara looked at him. She thought about the creek, about the water rights, about every rancher and farmer downstream who would be at Silas Crow's mercy the moment he controlled that water. She thought about Martin Briggs's face when she'd asked him about his renegotiated mortgage. She thought about 8 children inside this house who had no idea this conversation was happening. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'll need to consult with a few people before I respond." His patience thinned slightly. "This offer has a limited timeline, Miss Whitmore. I'd encourage you not to—" "I heard you," she said pleasantly. "I'll be in touch." She went back inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway until she heard his horse leave. Hannah was in the kitchen doorway. "What did he want?" she said. "The same thing he always wants," Clara said. "He just wrapped it differently this time." Hannah's jaw set in a way that was eerily similar to Elias's. "What are you going to do?" Clara hung her shawl on the peg by the door. "I'm going to write some letters," she said. "And then I'm going to make sure we have enough hay in the east barn to last the winter, because I'm not going to let us be in a position where practical necessity forces our hand." "That'll take all week," Hannah said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "So you should probably help me." Something shifted in Hannah's face. Not softened exactly, but unlocked slightly, the way a door unlocks when someone uses the right key. She didn't say anything, but she moved to the table and picked up the list she'd made the week before and turned it over and started a new list on the back. Clara went to the desk and got out paper and pen and began her first letter to the attorney in Dodge City. She wrote carefully. She laid out what she knew about the mortgage structure and what she suspected about the water rights, and she asked specific questions about probate law and guardian appointment procedures in Barton County and whether there were existing legal challenges to any Crow holdings in the county that might be relevant. She wrote until the candle went low. Then she sealed the letter and addressed it and set it by the door for Elias to take to the post office in the morning. Then she sat in the dark kitchen for a few minutes and let herself be tired, which was the only honest thing left to do at the end of a day like that. Outside, somewhere on the 320 acres that still belonged to this family. Still, for now, still, a nightbird was making a sound in the dark, and the creek ran east the way it always had, indifferent and steady, not knowing or caring what its value was to the people who would fight over the land it crossed. Clara blew out the candle and went to bed. She would need to be up before dawn again. There was no version of this that didn't require that. The letter from Dodge City arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Clara had sent hers. She was in the yard when Elias came back from the post office, and she could tell from the way he held the envelope, carefully, like it mattered, that he understood something important had come back. She wiped her hands on her apron and took it from him and opened it, standing right there in the yard because she couldn't wait the 30 steps to the house. The attorney's name was Edmund Carr. His letter was 4 pages, written in a precise hand that moved quickly through the procedural points she'd asked about, and then slowed down when it got to the part that mattered. He had found 2 other properties in Barton County with mortgage instruments containing near-identical acceleration clauses. Both had transferred to Crow ownership within the past 3 years, one following the death of the original borrower, and one following what the county record listed as voluntary conveyance, which Carr noted could mean several things, not all of them voluntary in any meaningful sense. He had also found, in the territorial land records, a water rights claim that Crow had filed 18 months ago on a creek system that matched the description of the one running through the Hale property, filed not as an acquisition, but as a prior use claim, which was a legal maneuver that established standing for future dispute even before the land itself was obtained. Crow hadn't been waiting for Robert Hale to die. He'd been preparing for it. Clara read that paragraph twice. "What does it say?" Elias asked. She folded the letter. "It says we're right about what he's doing," she said, "and it says we're not the only ones he's doing it to." Elias absorbed that. "Does it say how to stop him?" "It says there are grounds to contest the mortgage terms in probate," she said, "and it says the water rights claim he filed is legally thin if we can demonstrate continuous prior use and management of the creek by the property owner. She paused. It also says we should get a guardian appointed for the children by the county court as quickly as possible because a legal guardian can contest the debt in ways that I currently cannot. Can you be the guardian? She hadn't asked that question in her letter and Carr hadn't answered it, but she'd been thinking about it since she started reading. I don't know, she said honestly. I have no legal relationship to any of you. I'm not family. I'm not... She stopped. I'll write back and ask. She went inside and wrote the follow-up letter that afternoon. And then she did the thing she'd been putting off because she'd been waiting to understand more before she acted on it. She went to the desk and unfolded the surveyor's map, and in the margin where there was blank space, she wrote down every name she could think of who had reason to pay attention to what Silas Crow was doing in Barton County. Martin Briggs. 2 other ranchers she'd met briefly at the feed store. The widow who ran the dry goods store and had mentioned, offhand, that her late husband's land had been purchased by a cattle company 3 years ago. The German family 2 miles north, whose name she'd seen on a fence post but whom she hadn't spoken to yet. It was not a long list, but it was a start. The letter was still on the desk, waiting to be taken to the post office, when the stranger rode up 4 days later. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. He came from the north road on a gray horse, riding at a walk, which was the pace of a man who wasn't sure of his welcome. He stopped at the gate and sat there for a moment before dismounting, and something about the way he stood after he got down, one hand on the horse's neck, not moving toward the house yet, made her watch him longer than she normally would have watched a stranger. He was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the kind of stillness that comes from either great patience or great wariness, possibly both. He had a scar along his jaw that ran from ear to chin, old and healed silver. His coat was good but worn. He held his hat in the same hand that held the reins, and he looked at the house the way you look at something you're not sure will still be there if you blink. Elias came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw the man. The man saw Elias. He didn't move. Clara came out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" she said. The man looked at her, then at the house, then back at her. "I'm looking for the Hale place," he said. "I was told Robert Hale lived here." "Robert Hale died 6 weeks ago," she said. "Who are you?" A long pause, the kind that was doing something inside it. "Gideon Hale," he said. "I'm Robert's brother, at Gut." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a situation rearranging itself before anyone had decided what to do about it. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. Elias, behind him, had gone very still. "Elias," Clara said carefully, "why don't you go inside?" "I know who he is," Elias said. His voice was flat and cold in a way she'd never heard from him before. "He left. 12 years ago. He just left." Gideon didn't flinch at that, which told her he'd expected it. "I know," he said. He said it to Elias, not to Clara. "You don't get to just show up," Elias said. "You don't get to come here now and—" He stopped. His jaw worked. He was 12 years old and furious and holding about 6 weeks' worth of grief that had been waiting for somewhere to go. "He wrote to you. Did you know that? He wrote to you twice and you never wrote back." Gideon closed his eyes briefly. "I know that too." "Then why are you here?" "Because someone told me he was gone," Gideon said, "and I didn't have a reason to stay away anymore." Elias made a sound that wasn't quite a word and walked into the barn and pulled the door shut behind him, hard enough to be heard, but not so hard as to be a slam, which was somehow worse than a slam. It was controlled anger, contained anger, the kind that had learned to take up less space because the person carrying it had been taught that taking up too much space was a risk. Clara looked at Gideon Hale. "Come inside," she said. "We'll talk." She put coffee on because it was something to do with her hands while she thought, and she told him what had happened in the 6 weeks since Robert died in the careful, factual way she'd developed for situations where emotion was present but efficiency was necessary. The debt. The acceleration clause. Crow's visits. The attorney in Dodge City. The water rights claim she'd found in the territorial records. Gideon listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his coffee untouched, and he listened the way people listen when they are genuinely trying to understand rather than waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished, he said, "How long do you have?" "Carr thinks 3 to 4 months before Crow can move through probate. Maybe less if he has a sympathetic judge. Gideon nodded slowly. And the children? They're here. They're managing. She paused. Ruth was sick when I arrived. She's better now. Lily still cries at night. Thomas doesn't sleep enough. Hannah pretends she doesn't need anything. She heard herself listing them and stopped. They're doing what children do when they've had no choice but to manage. Gideon looked at his coffee. Robert wrote to me because he was sick, he said quietly. He didn't say he was dying. He said his heart had been giving him trouble and he wanted to... He stopped. I wrote back. 3 weeks ago. I didn't know it was already too late. Clara looked at him. What did he want? He wanted me to come. Gideon's voice was level, but something underneath it was not level at all. He said he had someone coming to help, but that he was worried about what happened if things went wrong, and he wanted me to be here. In case. She sat with that. You and Robert, she said. What happened 12 years ago? He looked at the table. It's a long story. I've got coffee, she said. He almost smiled. Then he told her. It was the kind of story that families accumulate over years of proximity and pressure. 2 brothers, different temperaments, a dead father's land that they couldn't agree on how to manage, and one bad night when an argument about money turned into something uglier, and Gideon had said things he couldn't take back and done something he'd spent 12 years being unable to talk about cleanly. He didn't try to make himself the wronged party. She gave him credit for that. He told it straight, including the parts where he'd been at fault, including the part where he'd left instead of coming back to fix it, because coming back meant looking at what he'd broken, and he hadn't been ready for that for a long, long time. What's on the other side of that scar? She said, when he was done. He touched his jaw reflexively. A man I owed money to, in Colorado, who felt strongly about the debt. Did you pay it? Eventually, he said. The hard way. She drank her coffee. Outside, she could hear James and Samuel chasing something around the yard, some small animal that had made the tactical error of appearing near children with nothing pressing to do. Life at its most ordinary. The children don't know you, she said. I know. Elias isn't going to make it easy. I know that too. She looked at him directly. Why should I trust you? It was a blunt question, and she meant it as one, and he received it as one. You shouldn't, he said. Not yet. I haven't given you a reason to. He met her eyes steadily. I'm asking for the chance to give you one. Clara put her cup down. She thought about what she had and what she needed. She thought about winter coming and 31 cattle that needed managing and a fence line that needed continuous attention and a legal fight that was going to require someone who could ride fast and be present in 2 places when she could only be in one. She thought about the children who needed more than she could provide alone, and she thought about Elias's face in the barn, furious and grieving, and she thought about the fact that trust was not a thing you decided in a kitchen over coffee. It was a thing that got built or didn't get built through the accumulation of small actions over time. You can stay in the barn, she said. For now. You'll work the same as everyone else, no different treatment, no authority over the children that they don't give you themselves. She paused. If you try to make decisions about this property or this family without talking to me first, you leave. If Elias tells you to go, you go. Those are the terms. Gideon looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. One more thing, Claire said. What do you know about water rights law in Kansas? He blinked. Some, he said slowly. I spent 2 years working for a land surveyor in New Mexico. Why? For the first time in 6 weeks, Clara felt something that was not exactly hope. Hope was too light a word for what the situation warranted, but something adjacent to it. The sense that the pieces on the board had shifted slightly in a direction that was less impossible than it had been that morning. Come with me, she said. I have a map to show you. Elias did not speak to Gideon for 4 days. This was not a passive silence. It was an active, deliberate architectural silence, constructed with the precision of a boy who had decided that acknowledgement was a thing he would control and withhold as he saw fit. He worked around Gideon in the barn and the yard and the pasture with the careful choreography of someone avoiding a piece of furniture he found offensive, never far enough away to be avoiding the work, never close enough to be engaging with the man doing it beside him. Gideon didn't push. Clara watched him not push and gave him credit for that too. What Gideon did instead was work. He worked the way a man works who has something to prove and knows the only currency that will buy what he needs is time and effort. He was up before anyone else, and she could hear him in the barn in the dark, moving around with a lantern, doing the early feeding without being asked. He found the section of the south fence that had been failing for longer than the northwest corner, deeper rot, longer neglect, and rebuilt it over 2 days without mentioning it to anyone, just did it and moved on to the next thing. He fixed the stove flue gasket that Clara had been meaning to get to for 3 weeks, sourcing the part from somewhere she didn't ask about, appearing one afternoon with it already done. He was careful with the younger children, not performatively careful, not the manner of a man trying to be seen being good with children, but naturally, quietly careful. When Lily wandered out to the barn and found him working and stood watching him with the frank curiosity of a 4-year-old, he didn't make a production of it, just kept working and told her what he was doing in a conversational tone, as though having a small observer was a perfectly normal part of his process. And she stayed for an hour and eventually fell asleep on a hay bale, and he put his coat over her without stopping what he was doing. Thomas watched this from across the barn. Thomas, who was 9 and watchful, and had assigned himself the role of evaluating every adult in his vicinity since his father died, watched and said nothing. On the 5th day, Gideon was replacing 2 rotten boards on the porch. They'd been soft underfoot since Clara arrived, and someone was eventually going to go through them, and he was working quietly, hammer and nails, measuring twice before cutting, and Elias came out the front door and stopped at the sight of him. They looked at each other. "You're doing that wrong," Elias said. Gideon looked at the board he'd just cut. "How so?" "The grain. It should run the other way or it'd freeze." A pause. Gideon looked at the board, looked at the remaining wood. "Your father teach you that?" Elias's jaw tightened. "Yes." Gideon set down the board he'd cut and picked up another piece and looked at it. "Show me," he said. Elias stood there for a moment, clearly having not expected that response, the resistance in his body unsure of what to do with agreement. Then he came off the porch steps and crouched beside the wood and showed him. Gideon watched and listened and followed the correction without any version of "you're just a boy" or "I've been building things since before you were born." He just listened and did it the way Elias said, and when it was done he said, "That's right, thank you." Elias stood up. He didn't say anything, but he also didn't leave. He stood there for another 10 minutes watching Gideon work, and when Gideon handed him the hammer to hold while he positioned the next board, Elias took it. Clara saw this from the window and did not allow herself to turn it into more than it was. One exchange, one hammer. The debt between them was enormous, and an exchange over porch boards barely scratched the surface of what needed to happen over months and years if it was going to happen at all. She turned back to the letter she was writing to Carr. But she noticed. The letter that came back from Dodge City 10 days after she'd sent the follow-up changed everything. Carr had found the 3rd property, a homestead 3 miles east of the Hale Ranch on the other side of the low ridge, where a family named Ketterman had been farming wheat for 7 years. The Kettermans had a mortgage, with the Crow Cattle Company, with an acceleration clause. And 2 months ago, Isaiah Ketterman had broken his leg badly enough that he'd been unable to work his land for the season, and Crow had sent notice of default. The Kettermans had 4 children and no lawyer. Clara read this paragraph, and then she read it again, and then she put the letter face down on the desk and went to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a few minutes because she needed the physical act of doing something before the anger settled into something useful. Gideon was at the kitchen table with the surveyor's map when she came in. He'd developed a habit of working at the table in the evenings, sometimes with the map, sometimes with what appeared to be his own notes on fence lines and cattle count and water flow patterns. He looked up when she set the letter in front of him. He read it. "Ketterman," he said, "I know Isaiah. We ran cattle together briefly years ago." "Can he be moved?" Clara said. "Is his leg healed enough that he could travel to Dodge City?" "What's in Dodge City?" "Carr has found a land attorney there who has filed against Crow before. A boundary dispute, nothing major, but it establishes that Crow can be contested. If we can get Isaiah Ketterman's signature on a joint filing, 2 properties challenging the same clause structure and the same lender's instruments, it changes the legal weight of the challenge considerably." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this a while." "I've been thinking about nothing else for 6 weeks, Clara said. He looked at the letter again. "I can ride out to the Ketterman place tomorrow. Talk to Isaiah. See where things stand. Take Elias, Clara said. He looked up. He knows Isaiah's eldest boy, she said, and he should be there. He's part of this family, and he should be treated like it. Gideon folded the letter and slid it back to her. All right. They came back from the Ketterman place the following evening with Isaiah's wife, Margaret Ketterman, sitting in the wagon seat beside Elias, and Isaiah himself lying in the wagon bed on a blanket with his leg in a splint and a look on his face that mixed embarrassment and relief in approximately equal measure. Clara came out to meet them. He can't ride for another 3 weeks, Gideon said from the saddle. But Margaret said they've had the letter from Crow, and they can't afford to wait 3 weeks to respond to it. We have room, Clara said. She looked at Margaret Ketterman, who was a thin woman with a determined face and eyes that had been doing quiet calculations since the moment she arrived. You'll stay here while we figure this out together. Margaret looked at the house, at the porch Gideon had repaired, at the children watching from the yard, James and Samuel with open curiosity, Hannah with her arms folded, Lily pressed against Hannah's side. We don't want to be a burden, Margaret said. You're not a burden, Clara said. You're leverage. Margaret stared at her. Then she laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, and climbed down from the wagon. The Ketterman children were 4, 2 boys and 2 girls, ages ranging from 5 to 13, and their arrival reorganized the household in ways that Clara hadn't fully anticipated. 8 children became 12 overnight, which meant the logistics of feeding and sleeping required renegotiation, which Hannah approached with the focused intensity of a general resupplying troops. She produced a sleeping arrangement within an hour that maximized the space without requiring anyone to share a bed with a stranger, which Clara thought was frankly impressive. Isaiah Ketterman, propped on a chair in the main room with his leg elevated and a cup of coffee in his hand, looked around at the combined household and said, Robert always said this place had room for more people than he knew what to do with. He was right, Clara said, though she hadn't known Robert well enough to know if he'd meant it the way it was currently manifesting. Gideon was in the doorway. Isaiah looked at him for a long moment. Gideon Hale, he said. I heard you were dead. Disappointed? Gideon said. Isaiah grinned. Surprised. Come sit down. You look like a man who's been working too hard and eating too little. Something in Gideon's posture loosened slightly, the particular loosening of a man who has been held at careful distance for weeks and has just heard someone speak to him without caution. He came in and sat, and for an hour the 2 men talked while Clara wrote letters at the desk and listened with half her attention, tracking the conversation for information she might need while Margaret Ketterman helped Hannah in the kitchen with the kind of competent, unsentimental helpfulness that came from a woman who had been managing a household alone for 2 months. From that conversation she learned several things. That Isaiah had known Crow for years and had never trusted him, but had needed the loan and hadn't had anywhere else to get it. That there were at least 2 other ranchers in the county who had similar arrangements but whom Isaiah couldn't name with certainty. That Crow had a man in the county court, not a judge, but a clerk who processed filings and could slow down or accelerate paperwork as needed. That last piece landed hard. Who is he? Clara said from the desk. Both men looked at her. Name, she said. The court clerk. Arvid Holt, Isaiah said. He's been there 8-9 years. Good friends with Crow's foreman. Clara wrote the name down. Thank you, she said, and went back to her letter. The thing that broke the surface 3 days later was the one she hadn't been looking for. She had been reorganizing the papers from Robert's desk, not searching, just sorting, creating order out of the accumulation of a man's working life. When she found the folder behind the bottom drawer. Not in the drawer. Behind it, in the small space between the drawer's back and the desk's actual rear wall, accessible only if you pulled the drawer fully out, which she had done because one of the drawer runners was misaligned and the drawer kept sticking. The folder contained 4 documents. The first was a survey report from 8 years ago that detailed the creek's flow rate and seasonal variation and noted, in technical language she had to read twice to follow, that the creek was fed by an underground source as well as surface runoff, which meant its flow was more consistent and more legally significant than a purely surface waterway. The second was a letter from a state land office employee, not an official document, a personal letter, that suggested Crow's prior use water claim, the one Clara had found in the territorial records, had been filed with information that the letter writer believed to be factually incorrect regarding the date of Crow's actual first use of that water source. The third was a hand-drawn map showing the creek's course across not just the Hale property, but 3 adjacent properties, with notes in Robert Hale's handwriting about where the water went, who used it, and what would happen to those downstream users if the creek were diverted at any point on the Hale land. The fourth was a deed, not for the main property, for a separate 10-acre parcel that contained the creek's primary surface emergence point, where the underground source broke through to the surface, registered separately in county records, with a water rights notation attached, and transferred to a name Clara didn't recognize. She stared at the deed. She turned it over. On the back, in Robert's handwriting, Gideon knows. Tell him to look for the Harmon deed. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went to find Gideon. He was in the north pasture, checking on 3 cows that had seemed off their feed that morning, and she walked out to him with the folder and handed him the deed without preamble. He read it. His face changed. Harmon, he said. You know the name. James Harmon. He worked for my father before Robert and I were born. He helped survey the original homestead claim. Gideon looked at the deed. If Robert registered this parcel separately with water rights attached. Crow's claim can't supersede it, Clara said. He filed a prior use claim on the creek system, but if the origination point is separately deeded with pre-existing water rights attached, his filing is defective, Gideon said. Legally defective. He filed against a resource he didn't have standing to claim. They looked at each other across the folder of documents. Robert knew, Claire said. He knew what Crow was doing, and he found this. And he was building toward contesting it, and then he died before he could do anything with it. Gideon was very still. He wanted me here, he said, not to her, to something inside the statement itself. He wanted me here because I'd know what the Harmon deed meant. I'm the only one who'd know James Harmon's name or why it mattered. He looked at the map, at the creek's path, at the careful notes in his brother's handwriting about downstream users and what they stood to lose. He was protecting the valley, Clara said quietly. Not just the ranch, the whole valley. Gideon didn't say anything for a while. The cows moved around them with the indifferent patience of animals who have no stake in human legal matters and would like their feed regardless. I need to go to Dodge City, he said finally. I need to take this to Carr in person, because a letter won't carry what needs to be carried. I know, she said. That means you're here alone. With all of them. She looked at the folder. I've been here alone since the beginning, she said. 2 more weeks won't change that. He looked at her. Not the assessing look he'd had when he arrived, when she was a stranger between him and something he didn't know how to approach. A different look. The look of a man recalibrating something he'd thought he understood. I'll leave Friday, he said. Take Elias with you as far as the Ketterman place, she said. Isaiah's letter needs to go with yours, and Elias should see what it looks like when someone actually tries to fight back through the right channels. He needs to know that's possible. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You think of everything. I think of what I can reach, she said. The rest I figure out when it gets here. She walked back to the house, leaving him with the cows and the folder and the weight of his brother's careful, far-sighted work. That evening, after the children were in bed and the Kettermans were settled and the house had gone quiet in its particular way. Never fully quiet with 12 people in it, always some small sound, a floorboard, a sleeper turning, the baby. She sat at the desk and looked at the map with Robert's handwriting on it and thought about a man she'd never met who had known his time was running out and had tried to leave a way through for the people who came after him. He had written 11 letters to her. She had answered every one. And then he had died before she arrived, and she had thought, on that train platform in the July heat, that she was walking into a broken promise. But sitting with his map and his notes and his hidden folder of evidence, she understood that Robert Hale had not broken his promise. He had kept it in the only way he could. He had left everything he'd found for someone else to carry forward. He just hadn't known who that someone would be. She folded the map carefully. Outside, somewhere north of the fence line, a coyote called once and went silent, and the Kansas dark pressed against the windows the way it always did, vast and indifferent, and full of things that would be manageable in the morning if she got enough sleep to manage them. She blew out the candle and went to bed. Gideon left on Friday before the sun was fully up. Clara stood on the repaired porch and watched him ride out with Elias beside him on the brown mare, the boy sitting straighter than usual, his shoulders set with the particular posture of someone who has been given a responsibility and intends to carry it correctly. They took the Harmon deed and the survey report, and the personal letter from the State Land Office employee, and Isaiah Ketterman's signed statement and 6 other documents that Clara had organized into a leather satchel the night before, each item wrapped in oilcloth against weather. She had also included a 3-page summary she'd written herself, laying out the timeline of Crow's acquisitions and the structural similarities between the mortgage instruments, because lawyers billed by the hour and a clear summary saved hours. She watched them until they were past the north fence line, and then she went inside because standing on the porch watching people leave was not a useful activity. The days without Gideon were quieter in some ways and more demanding in others. She had not realized how much she had come to rely on him to handle the outdoor work while she managed the legal correspondence and the household. And with him gone, she had to carry both simultaneously, which meant rising earlier and sleeping less and making judgment calls about what could wait until tomorrow that she'd previously been able to avoid making. The German family to the north, the Browers, had sent their eldest son over with a sack of turnips the week before as a neighborly gesture, and she had written back a short note inviting them for supper when it was convenient. They arrived on Saturday, all 6 of them, and the supper table was now a small assembly of people with shared concerns. And Clara spent as much of the meal listening as talking, learning the shape of the valley's anxieties from the inside. Heinrich Brauer was a careful man, deliberate with his words in a language that was still not entirely comfortable for him after 15 years. And he said things about Crow in the precise way of someone who had learned that being right and being believed were 2 different things. His wife Emma understood English better than she spoke it and tracked the conversation with sharp eyes that caught everything. Their son Werner, who was about Hannah's age, had the look of someone trying very hard not to be noticed at the table, which Clara recognized as the posture of a young person sitting among adults who are discussing things that affect him directly, but who has not been explicitly invited to contribute. She asked him directly what he thought. He startled slightly. Then he said, in careful English, "My father has been paying the creek water fee to Crow's man for 2 years. We did not know it was not legal." Clara set down her fork. "A fee?" Heinrich looked at his son and then at Clara. "A man came. He said Crow held the water rights on the eastern draw, and there was a monthly fee for downstream use. We paid. We did not know—" He paused, searching for the word. "We did not know to question." Clara looked at Margaret Ketterman, who was across the table and had heard this. Margaret's expression said she had not known either. "How many families have been paying this fee?" Clara said. Heinrich shook his head. "I do not know how many. The Parsons family, I think. Maybe the Lindqvist farm north of the ridge." After supper, after the Browers had gone home and the children were in bed, Clara sat at the desk and wrote until midnight. She was not writing to Carr. She was writing to the State Attorney General's office in Topeka because what Heinrich Brauer had described was not a mortgage dispute. It was extortion. An extortion that crossed county lines and involved fraudulent claims of water rights was not a county matter. It was a state matter, possibly a federal one, if it could be shown to involve fraudulent filing with territorial land offices. She wrote the letter carefully, stating only what she could document, making no claims she couldn't support, and she was 3 pages in when she heard a sound from outside that was not a night sound. She stopped writing. The sound came again. Not the coyotes, not the cattle settling, not the ordinary creak of a structure at night. Something deliberate. Footsteps, she thought, and then told herself she was tired and imagining, and then heard it again and knew she was not imagining. She put down the pen. She went to the window without lighting another candle. She was sitting in the low light of the one she was writing by. And she looked out into the yard, and it was dark, full October dark now, the kind that sat heavy and gave nothing away. But the horse in the paddock was moving, not grazing, moving the way horses move when something nearby is making them uneasy. She stood very still. Then she went to the door and took down the rifle from the rack beside it and checked that it was loaded, which it was, because she had checked it every night for 6 weeks on the principle that an unloaded rifle was a heavy club and nothing more. She did not go outside. She went instead to Hannah's room and woke her with a hand over her mouth and said very quietly into her ear, "I need you to listen to me and do exactly what I say." She felt Hannah come fully awake in about 2 seconds, which was fast, which was Hannah. "There is someone outside. I don't know who or how many. I need you to take all the children to the back bedroom, all of them, including the Kettermans, and lock that door and stay on the floor and not come out until I tell you. Can you do that?" Hannah's eyes were wide and very clear. She nodded. "Don't wake them loudly," Clara said, quietly, fast but quiet. She left Hannah to it and went back to the front room and stood near the window and waited. The horse had stopped moving. That was almost worse, because it meant whatever had made the horse nervous had either left or gone still. A minute passed. 2. She was starting to reconsider the whole thing, exhaustion and stress manufacturing threats from ordinary night sounds, when the first shadow moved across the yard, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had not been imagining anything. There were 3 of them that she could see, moving from the north side of the yard toward the barn, which was where the cattle were kept at night now that the weather had turned cold, moving quietly, with the deliberate quiet of men who had practiced this particular kind of quiet. She had about 30 seconds before they reached the barn door. She thought about firing a warning shot, and then thought about 12 children in the back bedroom and the fact that a warning shot invited return fire. And she thought about the fact that she was one woman with one rifle, and she did not know how many more men might be outside the range of her window. She did not fire. She watched. The 3 men reached the barn. One of them was carrying something she couldn't identify in the dark, and then she could identify it when he moved past the gap in the barn wall where a board had been loose since September and lantern light leaked through, and what he was carrying was a torch, unlit. And the thing that moved through her was not fear exactly, but something colder than fear, the recognition of what they intended. They were going to burn the barn, with the cattle inside. She thought about winter. She thought about 31 cattle that were their entire asset margin. She thought about the Ketterman children sleeping in the back room, and what happened to 12 children on a Kansas ranch in October, with no cattle and no barn. She opened the front door. "Stop where you are," she said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. The 3 men stopped. They were good at their kind of work. They recovered from surprise quickly, spreading apart, putting distance between themselves that made covering all 3 of them simultaneously impossible for a single rifle. "I have a rifle," she said, "and I've used one before. Put down what you're carrying." One of the men, in the middle, the one who had seemed to be giving direction to the other 2 by the way they oriented to him, said, "Ma'am, you should go back inside." "No," she said, "this doesn't need to get worse than it has to be." "Who sent you?" she said. Silence. "I know who sent you," she said, "and I want you to understand something. Whatever he told you this was, collecting a debt, handling a property matter, what you're about to do is arson and criminal trespass. Those are federal charges in this territory. I have documentation of what Silas Crow has been doing in this county, and it is currently in the hands of an attorney in Dodge City, and a letter is on its way to Topeka. So whatever he's paying you is not worth what comes next." The man in the middle was very still. "Back away from the barn," Clara said. Another silence, the long, suspended kind where something is being decided. Then, from the darkness to her left, a 4th man she hadn't seen stepped out of the shadows near the water trough, and he was holding something shorter than a rifle, and she understood in the precise moment of understanding that she had made a tactical error in coming outside, because outside she could be flanked, and she was being flanked, and there was nothing she could do about it now except not show that she knew it. "Clara." The voice came from the south side of the yard, and she knew it, and she had never in her life been so relieved to hear a voice she recognized. Gideon was in the yard. She didn't know how or when. He should have been 2 days from Dodge City, but he was there, to the south, with his own rifle up, and he wasn't alone. Isaiah Ketterman was beside him on a horse, leg splint and all, and Martin Briggs was there. And behind them in the dark she could hear more horses, more movement, and she realized with a disoriented clarity that she did not know when any of this had been arranged. "4 of you," Gideon said to the men by the barn. His voice was the quiet voice of a man who had stopped needing to perform threat because the situation made it unnecessary. "And I count 7 of us. You want to do the arithmetic, or should I?" The man in the middle put down the torch. It was over in 20 minutes. Not resolved. Not the thing underneath it. Not Crow, or the debt, or the water rights, or any of the tangled legal machinery that had been building for months. But the 4 men left the yard on foot after their horses were moved to the paddock, because Martin Briggs had made the practical observation that men without horses did not come back quickly, and they walked north in the dark toward the road, and Clara stood on the porch and watched them go. Then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had decided to stop working well, and she wanted to be closer to the ground. Gideon came and sat beside her. Not immediately. He let the others see to the horses and check the barn and do the things that needed doing first. And then he came to the porch and sat down 2 feet from her and didn't say anything for a moment. "You were supposed to be in Dodge City," she said. "We got there and back," he said. "Car needed 2 days. I came back as fast as the horse could carry me." He paused. "When I left Elias with the Kettermans to ride back, Isaiah said he was coming too, and that Briggs had been talking to him, and there were others who wanted to—" He stopped. "I didn't know about tonight. I didn't plan for tonight. I just rode hard because something felt wrong." "How did Martin Briggs know?" "He didn't. He was coming to tell you something, and he met us on the North Road, and we came together." Clara looked at the yard. Martin Briggs was talking to Heinrich Brauer, who had apparently arrived in the last wave of people Clara had not known were coming. She was still accounting for all of them. The Brauer boy, Werner, was helping Isaiah off his horse with the careful attention of someone who had also been told about tonight, at some point she'd missed. "How many people are in my yard right now?" she said. Gideon looked. 8, 9, counting Elias. Elias. She hadn't seen him yet. She stood up and looked past the cluster of men and horses and found him standing near the paddock gate, watching the north road where the 4 men had gone, his posture so much like his father's that it hit her sideways for a moment. The set of the shoulders, the weight on one hip, the way he held his stillness. She went to him. "You should be at the Kettermans," she said. "I rode back with Gideon," he said. He didn't look at her. "I wasn't going to stay there." "Elias, I'm the oldest," he said. "It's my family." She stood beside him and looked at the north road. "Yes," she said. "It is." He exhaled. Something in him settled slightly, the way things settle when the right thing has been said, even a small right thing in the middle of a very large, difficult situation. They got the full story in pieces over the next hour, from various people who had seen various parts of it. Martin Briggs had come to tell Clara that he'd heard from a man in town, a reliable man, he said, someone who worked at the livery and noticed things, that 4 of Crow's hired hands had ridden out together late that afternoon with torches and empty flour sacks, which was not the gear you took on a cattle run or a fence repair. He'd been alarmed enough to ride out himself, and he'd met Gideon and the others on the road. Gideon had pushed his horse for 12 hours straight from the point where he'd decided to come back, changing mounts once at a trading post north of the county line. He'd reached the Ketterman place by evening and found Elias there, and Elias had refused to stay behind, and by the time they'd reached the Brauer farm to water the horses, Heinrich had insisted on coming, and Werner after him. It was not a plan. It was the accidental coalition of people moving toward the same point from different directions for different reasons, which was possibly the only way coalitions actually formed in practice. Clara went inside when the last of the outside business was settled and found Hannah standing in the hallway outside the back bedroom with her arms folded and an expression that said she had been standing there for some time and was waiting for a report. "It's over for tonight," Clara said. Hannah looked past her at the door. "Are we safe?" "Tonight, yes." Clara said it plainly because Hannah was 14 and deserved a plain answer. "Tomorrow we need to talk about what comes next, and it's going to be complicated, but tonight, yes." Hannah nodded once. Then she turned and opened the back bedroom door and said to the collection of children inside in a voice that was attempting calm and mostly achieving it, "Everything's all right. You can come out." The Ketterman girl, 9-year-old, freckled, had barely said a word since she'd arrived, came out first and went directly to her mother, who was just behind Hannah, and Margaret Ketterman sat down on the hallway floor right there and held her daughter with a completeness that was not about the hallway floor at all, but about 6 weeks of managing alone and being frightened and holding it all up anyway, and for a moment the whole hallway just held that without trying to move it along. Lily appeared at Clara's knee and held up her arms. Clara picked her up, and Lily put her head on Clara's shoulder and was asleep again in approximately 4 minutes, which was the great mercy of small children, the capacity to collapse back into sleep when the emergency was declared over by a trusted person. Clara carried her back to bed. In the morning, Martin Briggs laid out what he knew about the court clerk. He had been thinking about what Clara had asked, about Arvid Holt, the name Isaiah had mentioned, and he had asked a few careful questions over the past 2 weeks, and what he'd found was that Holt had been processing mortgage default filings for Crow at speeds that were unusual for routine county business. Filings that should have taken 3 to 4 weeks to process were moving through in 10 days. Appeals from defaulting borrowers were being logged as received later than they'd actually arrived, which meant response deadlines looked missed when they hadn't been. "Can that be proven?" Clara said. "I have a man who will testify to the actual delivery dates of 2 filings, Briggs said. "He's the postmaster. He logs everything." Clara looked at Gideon, who had been sitting at the kitchen table through this whole conversation without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to appreciate about him. He understood when to hold still and listen. "Carr needs this," Clara said. "Today." "I'll write it," Gideon said. She looked at him. "You'll write it well?" "I spent 2 years writing survey reports for a land company," he said. "I know how to make facts legible." She pushed the pen and paper toward him, and he wrote, and she read it after and changed 2 things, and he didn't argue about either change. The response from Topeka came faster than she expected. 11 days after she'd sent the letter to the state attorney general's office, a man arrived at the ranch on a bay horse and introduced himself as Deputy Attorney Nathaniel Cross, sent from Topeka to investigate the allegations Clara had laid out. He was younger than she'd pictured from the title, 30, maybe 32, with the careful neutrality of someone who had been trained to arrive at situations without conclusions already formed, which she respected. He spent 3 days at the ranch. He interviewed Clara, Gideon, Isaiah Ketterman, Martin Briggs, Heinrich Brauer, and the postmaster from Walnut Creek, whom Briggs brought out on the second day. He read every document in the leather satchel and several documents that Carr had forwarded from Dodge City. He was particularly interested in the Harmon deed and the water rights claim, and he spent a long time with the personal letter from the state land office employee, reading it 3 times. On the 3rd evening, he sat at Clara's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said, "I want to be clear about what I can and cannot tell you at this stage." "Please," Clara said. "I can tell you that the water rights claim Mr. Crow filed is defective on its face, given the prior registered deed you've produced, and that the land office will be notified to suspend that claim pending formal review." He paused. "I can tell you that the conduct Mr. Holt has been engaged in at the county court is a serious matter and will be referred to the appropriate authority." Another pause. "I can tell you that the extortion of downstream water fees from families in this valley, if it can be demonstrated to have occurred as described, is criminal, and I intend to demonstrate it." "And Crow?" Clara said. Cross looked at his coffee. "Mr. Crow is a significant landowner with significant legal resources, and we will need to build a thorough case before any formal action can be taken against him personally. I want to be honest with you about that. This will take time." "How much time?" Gideon said from the doorway. "Months, possibly longer." Cross looked at Clara. "But in the immediate term, I can seek an injunction from the territorial court that prevents any enforcement of the acceleration clause in the Hale mortgage pending resolution of the larger investigation. That protects this property and the children in it while the rest is sorted through." Clara heard this and held it, and made sure she'd understood it correctly. "He can't move on the property while the investigation is active?" she said. "Not legally," Cross said. "And whatever else Mr. Crow is, he appears to have operated through legal mechanisms rather than outside them, which means the threat of losing those mechanisms is a significant deterrent." He looked at her steadily. "Last week's incident at your property, the men, the torches, if that can be tied to him, and I believe it can, it changes his calculus considerably. That is not the action of a man confident in his legal position." She thought about that for a while after Cross went to bed. The 4 men from that night had not given Crow's name when Gideon and the others had held them at the paddock gate. But Martin Briggs had recognized one of them as a man who had worked Crow's cattle the previous spring, and that was a thread, and threads pulled. Gideon came inside from checking the horses and sat down at the table. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about the families that have been paying water fees for 2 years, she said. "I'm thinking about how Cross gets to all of them before Crow does." "Cross seems competent." "Competent isn't the same as fast," she said. "Crow will know someone is asking questions within the week. He has ears in this county. Gideon was quiet. Then we need to get to the families first. Yes, she said, we do. She sent letters to every name on her list the next morning, 8 in all, each one carefully worded. Not alarming, not official sounding, just a neighbor asking a neighbor to come for supper on Saturday and bring whatever documents they had related to their land arrangements with anyone without specifying who. She was not going to make the mistake of announcing what she was doing before she had done it. 6 families came on Saturday. The kitchen table was inadequate for the number of people, and Clara moved everything to the yard where it was cold enough now to make the coat necessary, but where there was room for everyone. Heinrich and Emma Brower came with their children, a family named Parsons from the south end of the valley, quiet people who had been farming grain for 5 years, and who had signed a water fee arrangement that they'd understood to be a county assessment. A widow named Dearbale Flynn, who had a 40-acre parcel adjoining the Hale eastern boundary, and who turned out to have been paying the water fee longer than anyone else, 3 years, and who came with the financial records to prove every payment, laid out in meticulous columns in a small journal she kept inside her coat. Dearbale Flynn was approximately 60 years old and had the look of someone who had been underestimated consistently throughout her life and had developed a very particular relationship with that experience. I thought it was legal, she said, placing her journal on the table with a precision that was not without anger. I thought it was a levy. If I had known... She stopped. I have very good records. I can see that, Clara said. I want it back, Dearbale said. Every penny. I know, Clara said. That's part of what we're building toward. She spent 3 hours in that yard with those 6 families, going over what Deputy Cross had told her, what Carr had found, what the harm indeed meant for all of them, and what the investigation in Topeka could mean if they cooperated with it fully. She was careful to be honest about the timeline and about the uncertainty, because people who are promised more than can be delivered do not come back when you need them. She told them it would take time and that Crow was not finished yet, and that the outcome was not guaranteed, and she told them what she believed they could win if they stayed together and kept their records and testified to what had actually happened to them. Gideon stood near the fence through most of this and said very little. Isaiah Ketterman, who had arrived on a horse now rather than in a wagon because his leg was healing, sat near the gate and listened and added things when Clara asked him to, because he knew some of these people better than she did, and there was credibility in him that came from being a man who had also been wronged and was still present and still fighting. Elias was there too. She had told him he could stay, and he had, quiet in the way he was quiet now, not the rigid, closed quiet of the first weeks, but something more open. He watched the families in the yard with the same attention he gave to everything he was trying to understand. At the end of the afternoon, when people were getting ready to leave, Martin Briggs pulled Clara aside. Crow Nose Cross is in the valley, he said quietly. She had expected this. How do you know? His foreman was in town yesterday asking questions about who had been out to the Hale place. She looked out at the families still gathering themselves in the yard, the children running at the edges of the group the way children run when adults have been sitting and talking for too long. How long before he acts? I don't know, Briggs said. But he's scared now. And scared men make mistakes, she said, or they get worse. She looked at him. We need Cross to move fast. I'll ride to where Cross is staying tonight, Briggs said. Tell him what I told you. She nodded. Then she went back to her guests because there was still coffee, and the Parsons children had not eaten, and the yard was full of people who had come because she'd asked them to, and who deserved to leave feeling that something had been accomplished. Cross moved faster than she'd dared expect. He had been building something while he sat quietly at her kitchen table for 3 days, she realized, and he didn't show her the shape of it until he was ready to use it. He went to the county seat on Monday and filed for the injunction, and the injunction was granted on Wednesday by a circuit judge who had no connection to Arvid Holt, because Cross had made sure of that. Holt was suspended from his position pending investigation on Thursday. And on Friday morning, 2 federal officers arrived at the Crow Ranch house with documents that Clara did not see directly, but whose arrival Briggs reported to her by midday with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been holding a long breath. She was at the cook stove when he told her, stirring something that needed stirring, and she kept stirring for a moment after he finished talking. What kind of documents? She asked. Arrest warrant, Briggs said. For the men from your barn, the night of the torches. One of them talked. Cross knew he would if he waited long enough and put enough pressure on the right threads. He paused. He named Crow. Clara set down the spoon. "Is it enough?" she said. "It's a start," Briggs said. "For the arson charge, yes. For the rest, the water fees, the mortgage fraud, the court clerk, that's going to take longer. But the injunction holds. The property is protected while the case is built." She stood at the stove for a moment. She thought about the night the four men had come across the yard with torches, and the horse moving in the paddock, and the sound she'd heard that had sent her to the rifle on the rack. She thought about 12 children in a back bedroom, and Hannah holding them there with nothing but her 14-year-old authority and the instruction Clara had given her. She thought about Gideon appearing in the dark from the south with Martin Briggs behind him, and not knowing how he knew to come. She picked up the spoon and went back to stirring. "Tell Cross," she said, "that Dearbale Flynn has 3 years of payment records in a journal she keeps inside her coat. He should interview her first." Briggs looked at her. "That woman wants her money back," Clara said, "and she's got the records to get it. That's your strongest secondary case right there." Briggs left, and Clara finished what she was cooking, and when Hannah came in from the garden with mud on her boots and the kind of color in her face that came from cold air and real work, Clara said, "Set the table. 15 minutes." Hannah looked at her. "Good news?" "Some," Clara said. "Enough for today." Hannah set the table. Outside, the October sun was doing its low sideways work across the Kansas grass, turning everything briefly golden before it gave up and went down. And the ranch, sagging less now than it had in July, patched and worked and lived in by too many people for its size and better for it, sat in that light the way things sit when they have endured something and come out the other side still standing, not unscathed, not finished with difficulty, but standing. Gideon came in from the barn stamping mud from his boots, and Elias was behind him, and James ran past both of them, chasing Samuel over something that would turn out to be nothing. And Lily called from the back room that she couldn't find her other shoe, and Ruth, in her wooden box that had been upgraded twice now as she grew, made the sound that meant she was awake and ready for the world's attention. Clara went to get Ruth. She lifted her, and Ruth grabbed her collar with both hands the way she always did, and Clara carried her to the window and showed her the last of the evening light on the grass. And Ruth looked at it with the full seriousness of a 6-month-old encountering beauty. And that was the moment Clara understood, not for the first time but more completely than she had before, that the thing she had built here was not temporary and was not accidental and was not going to stop being hers regardless of what came next in the legal proceedings or the long months of the case or whatever Silas Crow had left to throw at them. It was hers. Not the land. The land was complicated and would be complicated for months yet. But the rest of it. The table being set, and the boots at the door, and the missing shoe, and the children calling to each other through the walls of a house that had been falling apart when she arrived, and was not falling apart anymore. She kissed Ruth's forehead, and turned away from the window, and went to help get supper on the table. The case took 8 months. Claire had known it would take time, Cross had told her that plainly, and she had believed him, but knowing a thing and living inside it are different experiences, and the 8 months were not easy months. They were months of correspondence and waiting and occasional setbacks, and the grinding, unglamorous work of keeping a household and a legal challenge moving forward simultaneously, which turned out to be the kind of thing that didn't look like courage from the inside. From the inside, it looked like writing the same information in slightly different forms for different offices, and checking on the cattle, and making sure James did his arithmetic, and Samuel stopped using the fence post for target practice, and Lily ate something other than biscuits. The injunction held. That was the central fact around which everything else organized itself. Crow could not move on the property while the investigation was active, and the investigation was active, and so they were safe in the specific legal sense while the larger thing ground slowly forward in Topeka. Silas Crow hired 3 lawyers. Clara learned this from Cross in February, delivered in the neutral tone of a man reporting a fact rather than a threat. 3 lawyers from Kansas City, expensive ones, which told her that Crow was frightened enough to spend seriously. Frightened men with resources were dangerous in particular ways. They fought differently than confident men, with more desperation and less consistency. And she filed that information away and made sure Carr and Dodge City knew it too. The water fee case was the first thing that broke. Dearbale Flynn's records turned out to be even better than Clara had anticipated. The woman had been keeping accounts since before the war, and her journal was a document of such meticulous clarity that Cross called it the most useful piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Cross told Clara this in March, in a letter that was more personal in tone than his previous communications, and she read it at the desk with a feeling that was partly satisfaction and partly something she couldn't name. The particular feeling of watching a person you'd read correctly turn out to be exactly as capable as you'd believed. Dearbhale got her money back in April. Not all of it. The proceedings didn't allow for full restitution at that stage, but enough to matter, enough to be real, and she rode out to the Hale Ranch the day the check cleared and sat in the kitchen with Clara and drank coffee and said, "I want you to know that I am not a woman who cries easily." "I know," Clara said. "I'm just saying," Dearbhale said and drank her coffee. The Parsons family and the Browers received their restitution in May. By then the county clerk situation had been resolved. Arvid Holt had resigned rather than face formal proceedings, and the man who replaced him had no connection to Crow's operation, which meant filings moved at their actual pace rather than Crow's preferred pace. Crow's 3 lawyers succeeded in slowing the mortgage fraud case considerably, which was frustrating but not surprising. They introduced procedural challenges that ate weeks. They disputed the interpretation of the acceleration clause on technical grounds that required Carr and Cross to prepare extensive responses. They contested the relevance of the harm indeed on the basis of a surveying irregularity from the original 1851 filing, which sent Gideon back to Dodge City for a week in March, with a supplementary affidavit from a surveying firm that cost money. Clara didn't have easily available and paid anyway because some costs were not optional, but the arson charge was simpler because one of the 4 men had named Crow, and that man was willing to testify, and testimony from an actual participant in an actual crime was not something that 3 Kansas City lawyers could make procedurally complicated enough to survive. Crow was arraigned in federal court in June. The proceeding was covered in the Kansas City paper under a headline that Clara read at the desk on a Tuesday morning while Ruth sat on her lap grabbing at the edges of the paper. And what she felt reading it was not triumph, because triumph implied an endpoint, and this was not an endpoint, just a significant turn in a long road. Gideon read it over her shoulder. "How do you feel?" he said. "Tired," she said, "and glad." "That seems right," he said. The mortgage was restructured in July. Not eliminated, the debt was real and had always been real, and Clara had never expected it to disappear. But with the original mortgage instrument under legal scrutiny and Crow's ability to enforce it compromised by his own conduct, Carr had negotiated a restructuring through the county court that reset the terms to something a working ranch could manage over time. The acceleration clause was voided. The interest rate was adjusted. The remaining principal was extended over 12 years at terms that were not comfortable but were survivable. Clara signed the restructuring agreement on a Wednesday afternoon in Carr's Dodge City office, with Gideon beside her and Elias standing near the window because he'd insisted on coming and she hadn't argued. The attorney notarized the document and pushed it back across the desk. "Congratulations," he said, with the measured warmth of a man who had worked on enough of these cases to understand what they actually cost. "This one was worth fighting." "Yes," Clara said, "it was." She folded her copy of the agreement and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her body, and walked outside into the July heat that was not so different from the July heat of a year ago when she'd stepped off the train at Walnut Creek Station with $43 in her boot and no idea what she was walking into. Elias was beside her on the street, squinting in the sun. "Is it done?" he said. "That part is," she said. He nodded slowly. He was 13 now, had been for 2 months, and the year had done something to his face that was not aging exactly. He hadn't lost the boy in it, but there was more resolution there, more settled certainty about who he was. He'd grown 3 inches since July. He'd learned to keep the cattle accounts, not because Clara had insisted, but because he'd picked up the ledger one evening and started and kept going. "Are you glad you stayed?" he asked. He said it looking straight ahead, the way he asked things that mattered. She looked at the street, at the ordinary business of a Kansas town on a Wednesday afternoon, people moving with their own purposes, their own weight, their own private urgencies. "Yes," she said, "from about the second day." He glanced at her sideways. "You seemed certain from the first night." "I was not certain," she said. "I was decided. Those are different things." He thought about that. "What's the difference?" "Certain is when you know the outcome," she said. Decided is when you choose to move forward without knowing it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what you tell yourself when things are bad?" "It's what I tell myself when things are hard," she said. "Bad is different. When things are bad, you just get through them and figure out the lesson after." He almost smiled. It was a real almost smile, not the guarded version he'd started with. "That sounds like something Papa would say." "Then your father was a sensible man," Clara said. They stood there for another minute in the July heat, and then Gideon came out of the office behind them, and the three of them walked back to where the horses were tied and the road home was waiting. Gideon asked her in August. Not with ceremony, not in any planned or staged way. They were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed. This had become their habit over the months, the quiet end of the day, when the house settled and they could talk without managing anyone. And they had been talking about the south pasture, which needed attention, and the conversation had gone quiet in the comfortable way it went quiet now, no longer the careful quiet of two people not yet sure of each other. He said, "Clara." She looked at him. "I've been trying to think of the right way to say this," he said, "and I don't think there is one, so I'm going to say it plainly." "All right," she said. "I want to marry you," he said, "not because of the ranch or the children, or because it makes practical sense, though it does. Because I don't want to be somewhere else. I've spent 12 years being somewhere else when I should have been here, and I'm done with that. And what I actually want, when I'm being honest with myself, is to be here, and for you to be here, and for that to be the arrangement we choose on purpose rather than the one we've fallen into by necessity." The porch was very quiet. Somewhere in the dark, a cricket had opinions. Clara looked at her hands. She thought about the train from St. Louis. The letter she'd read so many times, the fold lines went soft. 11 exchanges with a man she'd never met, who had died before she arrived, who had left her in an impossible situation that had turned out to contain everything she hadn't known she was missing. She thought about Lily asking in the dark, "Are you going to leave?" and the word that had come out of her before she'd finished thinking it through. She thought about what she had come west to find and what she had found instead, and she thought about the difference, which was not what she would have predicted a year ago, but which she understood now as not a compromise but a correction, life steering her toward something truer than the plan she'd arrived with. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't always—" "Clara," Gideon said. "I'm saying this so you know," she said. "I manage things. It's not always a comfortable quality." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you manage things for 9 months. I'm asking you anyway." She looked at him. He was not a simple man. He had a scar along his jaw and 12 years of regret worked into him and a tendency towards silence that could look like distance when it wasn't. He was stubborn about certain things, and she'd had to learn which things and work around them, and he'd had to learn the same about her. He was not the husband she'd traveled west to marry. He was the one she'd met in the middle of something genuinely difficult and discovered she could stand beside and not feel diminished by and trust, which was not nothing, which was, she had come to understand, almost everything. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. She hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "All right," he said. Quiet, but his voice had something in it. "All right," she said. They sat on the porch a while longer in the August dark, not differently than they'd been sitting before, except that they were different, and the dark and the cricket and the ranch around them were the same as they'd always been, indifferent to human arrangements, and that indifference was its own kind of comfort. The world was very large and had seen many people decide things on porches, and had continued regardless, and would continue regardless. And in the meantime, here were two people choosing something on purpose. They were married in September, in the yard of the ranch, because the house was too small, and the valley had apparently decided this was a community event, whether or not Clara had planned for it to be one. 14 families came. Deerpale Flynn brought an apple cake that she placed on the table with the same precision she brought to her financial records. Heinrich and Emma Brower came with all their children, and Emma cried at the appropriate moment with the openness of someone from a culture that didn't find public emotion embarrassing. The Kettermans came, Isaiah walking without the splint now, his leg healed to something functional, if not perfect, a slight hitch in his gait that would probably stay with him. Martin Briggs was there. He shook Gideon's hand for a long time and didn't say much, which was how Martin Briggs expressed the things that mattered to him. Elias stood at Gideon's side through the ceremony, not because anyone had told him to. He'd placed himself there that morning and stayed. And when Gideon noticed, he didn't comment on it, and Elias didn't explain it, and that was the whole of the conversation they needed to have about it. Hannah had made the dress. Not alone. She and Clara had worked on it together over 3 weeks, in the evenings, which was how Clara discovered that Hannah had taught herself to sew from a book and had been doing it quietly for 2 years, and that she was better at it than she'd admitted to anyone. The dress was simple because Clara was not a woman who wanted complicated things, and Hannah had understood this without being told. Thomas carried Ruth through the ceremony. Ruth was 10 months old and extremely interested in everything around her and needed to be continuously redirected from grabbing at whatever was nearest, which Thomas managed with the patient competence of someone who had been her primary protector since she was 4 months old and considered this a serious, ongoing responsibility. James and Samuel had been told to behave and had interpreted this as a challenge. They behaved in the specific sense of not actively causing disruption, while maintaining throughout the ceremony an air of suppressed energy that suggested they had plans for immediately after. Lily stood beside Clara and held her hand through the whole thing and afterward said, very seriously, "Now you're really staying." "I was already really staying," Clara said. "I know," Lily said. "But now it's official." Whoop. Silas Crow's trial concluded in November. He was convicted on the arson charge and 2 counts of fraudulent misrepresentation in land dealings and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The water fee fraud added 18 months. His land holdings were subject to a separate civil proceeding that would take another year to fully resolve, but the practical result was that his operation in Barton County was dismantled. The foreman left, the hired hands scattered, the mortgages he held on other properties were reviewed by the court, and several were restructured or voided on the same grounds as the Hale mortgage. Clara read the conviction notice at the desk on a gray November morning with rain against the windows, and Ruth on her hip, and a household full of people doing ordinary things around her. She read it and then folded the paper and set it aside and went to help with breakfast, because what she felt was not the satisfaction she might have expected a year ago, but something quieter. The specific quiet of a long-running noise that has finally stopped. She mentioned it at breakfast, calmly, and the table received it variously. Hannah nodded once and looked at her plate, which meant she was feeling something she needed time to process. Thomas said "good" in the flat tone of someone who had finished a thing in his mind and was ready to move on. James wanted to know if that meant Crow would be in jail on Christmas, which led to a side conversation about how calendar dates related to sentencing that was not fully resolved. Samuel said nothing, but he straightened slightly in his chair, a small physical relief. Elias, across the table, looked at her and then looked at Gideon. "Is it over?" he said. "The criminal case, yes," Clara said. "The civil proceedings will go on for a while, but nothing that affects us directly anymore." Elias turned this over. "What happens to the water?" "It stays where it's always been," she said, "running through our land, belonging to no one downstream until it gets there." He nodded. He picked up his fork and went back to eating, and that was his way of saying that was enough, that the thing they'd been fighting for was intact, and he could proceed. What Clara understood later, when there was enough distance from the hardest parts to see them clearly, was that she had never found what she came west looking for. She had come for a husband, an arrangement, a stable life built on a clear transaction between 2 adults who had agreed on terms in advance. It was a reasonable thing to want. She had been practical about it, not romantic. She was 31 years old and she knew the difference between a story and a plan, and she had chosen a plan. The plan had collapsed on a train platform in July heat, delivered by a 12-year-old boy in bare feet, and everything that followed had been built not from the plan, but from the refusal to leave when the plan was gone. That refusal had not felt heroic at the time. It had felt like the only thing she could do without becoming someone she didn't recognize. And the distinction mattered because people often call necessity by the name of courage, and she had been trying her whole life not to mistake the one for the other. What she had in the end was not a life she had designed. It was a life she had stayed for, which was a different kind of choosing. Not the clean decision made in advance, but the 1,000 small decisions made in the middle of difficulty, each one saying again, this, here, these people, this ground. She had not saved the children. They had, in the way of children who are given the chance, largely saved themselves. Hannah with her lists and her sewing and her 14-year-old ferocity, Elias with his father's ledger and his careful corrections of Gideon's porch work, Thomas with his watch over Ruth that had never wavered, James and Samuel with the resilience of boys who turned everything into motion, Lily with her direct questions in the dark that had refused to let Clara pretend she didn't know what she was deciding. She had given them a framework to save themselves within, which was perhaps what adults were supposed to do for children, and so rarely managed. She had not fixed what was broken in Gideon either. He had done that himself, slowly, through the accumulation of hours worked and things said honestly, and the choosing to stay when staying was uncomfortable. There was still something in him that could go quiet in a way that worried her, a door she hadn't learned to open yet, and she suspected there were things from those 12 years he might never fully tell her, and she had made her peace with that because what she had of him was real and present and consistent, and that was more than she'd contracted for. She had not won a legal battle. She had gathered people who had reasons to fight and given them a place to do it from, and the winning had been collective and messy and dependent on a dozen things that could have gone differently. A postmaster's logs, a state attorney's competence, a deputy willing to ride fast, a man in Colorado who had eventually been paid what he was owed and so had left Gideon's face with just the scar. What she had done, she thought, was stay. She had stayed when staying was not logical and not safe and not promised to end well, and in the staying she had become the person this family needed, not by plan but by accumulation. That was the only lesson she trusted from it, not that goodness wins or that courage is rewarded or that the right thing has a guaranteed outcome, because she had been lucky in ways she couldn't take credit for, and she knew it. Just that staying mattered, that the choice to remain in a hard place and keep working the problem was itself a form of building, and what got built from it was real even when it wasn't what you'd originally planned to build. Ruth walked at 11 months, earlier than any of the others had, and this was treated by the entire household as a personal achievement to be celebrated with a degree of enthusiasm that slightly exceeded the objective significance of a baby taking steps. Thomas was present for the first steps, and his face in that moment was the face of someone witnessing the completion of something he had invested in deeply and for a long time. Hannah finished the quilt she'd been working on through the winter and gave it to Clara on a February morning without ceremony, setting it on the desk and leaving before Clara could respond, which was Hannah's way of giving things, quickly, before the giving became uncomfortable. The quilt was meticulous and warm and not quite symmetrical in one corner, which made it more beautiful than a perfect quilt would have been. Elias turned 14 in the spring, and Clara and Gideon gave him the responsibility of the cattle accounts, in a formal way, sitting down with him at the desk and handing him the ledger and saying, "This is yours now. You've been keeping it better than anyone. It should be official." He took the ledger with both hands and set it carefully on his side of the desk, and did not say much about it. But that evening he stayed up later than usual, doing the accounts by lamplight, and Clara, passing the doorway, saw him there and didn't interrupt. She just kept walking. The house was always full of something. That was the permanent condition of the Hale Ranch in the years that followed, full of people, full of noise, full of the ongoing drama of children becoming who they were going to be. James developed a talent for horses that turned practical and then exceptional. Samuel found mathematics at 12 and became absorbed in it with an intensity that suggested a mind that had found its proper use. Lily grew into someone of such clear-eyed directness that she routinely said the thing everyone else was thinking but not saying, and this quality could be inconvenient, but it was also, Clara thought, exactly what the world needed more of. Thomas never quite let go of his protectiveness. It simply expanded outward, past Ruth and the family, and eventually toward the wider world, in ways that would shape what he became. Ruth herself grew into someone with an entirely different quality of attention, slower and more thorough, the kind of person who noticed what everyone else had walked past. There was a morning, years later, when Clara was standing at the kitchen window watching Ruth and Lily and two of the Ketterman children and one of Hannah's children and three others she couldn't immediately identify from the back, doing something in the yard that involved a great deal of apparent disagreement about the rules, and Gideon came up behind her with coffee and handed her a cup and looked out the window with her. "What are they doing?" he said. "I have no idea," she said. They watched. "How many children are in our yard?" he said. She counted. 9, I think. One might be a Brower. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. When you got off that train, he said, in July of '83, what did you think you were walking into? She considered it. I thought I was walking into a marriage with a man I'd agreed to reasonable terms with, in a place that would be difficult but manageable. And instead, she said, this. She gestured at the window, at the 9 children, or possibly 10, at the yard that had been repaired and then expanded and was currently in the process of having a new fence installed by Elias and his 16-year-old judgment about what needed doing. At the ranch that was 320 acres of paid-down land under a sky that was doing its October thing, blue and enormous and indifferent in the specific way she had come to love. Indifferent meaning it asked nothing of her, offered nothing, stood witness without judgment. Just the sky and the land and the people who had chosen to stay on it. Better? Gideon said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Harder and better and nothing like what I planned. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They stood at the window and drank their coffee while the yard full of children argued about whatever they were arguing about, and the October light came sideways through the glass, and somewhere in the house behind them, something fell over, and someone called out, and someone else answered, and the ordinary noise of a full life continued on without them for a moment while they stood still inside it. She had come west looking for a husband and found a family. She had come west with a plan and found something that no plan could have contained. She had come west and stayed, and the staying had been everything. Not because the staying was easy, it never had been, and the years that followed had their own difficult seasons, their own things that broke and had to be fixed, their own nights when the problem felt bigger than the resources available to address it. But because the staying was real, and what was built from it was real, and the people around that kitchen table and in that yard and in the rooms of that house that no longer sagged were real, and she was real among them. Not the woman she'd planned to become when she answered an advertisement in a Missouri newspaper, but someone she recognized as more completely herself than that woman would have been. That was the thing she would have said if anyone had asked her what the lesson was. Not that love conquers difficulty, not that the right choice is always clear, not that good people are always protected from harm, just that the greatest things in a life are rarely the things you planned for. They are the things you stayed for, in the places you almost left, with the people who needed you in ways you hadn't anticipated, and who, without meaning to and without formal agreement,